You're locked into Inception Radio Network, Superior, Wisconsin.
You're tuned in to NightVision Radio, exposing the truth one secret at a time. Prepare yourself as we explore the shadow worlds of suppressed history, secret knowledge, forbidden religion, and shine a light on the conspiracies to keep it all from us. Welcome to NightVision Radio. Welcome to NightVision Radio. I'm your host, René Barnett. Man, this has been one heck of a week. I don't know if you guys have felt it, but it seems like somehow time is speeding up. And since we have a physicist on our show tonight, maybe we can ask some questions about that or why it feels that way. Also, I want to remind you that the archives are located on InceptionRadioNetwork.com, so that after this show, shortly, the shows are available there. The shows are also available on iTunes and Stitcher, and there's lots of other ways to listen. So check on InceptionRadioNetwork.com for all the ways to listen to the show. You know, this week and last week, I had my email hacked, and I don't know why these people get off on doing this kind of stuff, but last week I was sending everybody out emails about transvaginal mesh, and this week I've been sending people emails that alert them to the fact that there's a pedophile in their neighborhood. Not that there's not a pedophile in your neighborhood, believe me, there is, but the email was not from me. So if you got one of those emails from me this week, I do apologize, and I have taken immediate steps both times to change things around so that doesn't happen again. But I guess it's happening a lot because I had another couple of friends who were hacked in exactly the same way this week. So we'll try to keep an eye on that and keep those silly emails to a minimum. Now, we will go from the ridiculous to the sublime. And our guest tonight is nuclear physicist Stanton Friedman. He calls himself the flying saucer physicist, so I'm not being derogatory when I say that, because he is one of the few academics that are out speaking out loud about the UFO subject, about government secrecy, and of course he's known as the original Roswell researcher, and with his book Crash at Corona revealed a lot of the details for the first time to the public. So welcome, Stanton Friedman, to our show.
Well, I'm glad to be here. I've never been described as sublime before, but
well, certainly not ridiculous. I'll say that. And my email hacking is really getting on my nerves, but I'm going to let that go tonight and get into some really interesting stuff with you. Now, I know that you just were at the anniversary of the Roswell event in Roswell, New Mexico, this past weekend, right?
Yes, it was the annual festival, Roswell Festival. There were over 6,000 people came over the 3 or 4 days, loads of lectures and panels, and sold a lot of books, met a lot of lovely people. It was hot, but that's Roswell. You know?
Yes.
So it went very well. I was very pleased with it. Nobody brought an alien body to me to show, but otherwise, you know, it was good. And a lot of people think that if you come out strongly pro-UFO, you're going to get a hard time. And I don't. You know, 700 plus lectures. I've had 11 hecklers, and 2 of them were drunk. And you get that many if you talk about religion or sports or politics or anything like that. So that's no problem. But there is a problem in ufology, that there are all kinds of people saying all kinds of things and forgetting the basic rule, which should be have facts in hand before putting mouth in gear, or computer in gear, as the case may be. And there are a lot of people saying a lot of things that simply aren't true. They read it on the internet, or they saw it on YouTube or whatever. And, my face is on YouTube a lot, but that doesn't mean I think you should believe everything you hear on YouTube or read on the internet, for goodness sakes.
That's right. I have a good friend, author Henry Lincoln, who says, believe no one, not even me. He said, because belief is the key word. Don't believe it, know it. Find out for yourself, corroborate it before you go around making pronouncements. And that is a big problem in ufology, and has been for a long, long time.
Yes. And it worries me greatly because, there's a new generation growing up, and they're less critical, I think. If they see it on YouTube or the internet, they believe it. And they wouldn't put it on there if it wasn't true, right? Wrong.
Exactly.
But, people are certainly showing a lot of interest in UFOs. You can see all the shows that are on television and stuff. That means something. And one of the interesting things this weekend in Roswell was how many families were there, people bringing their kids. It's family entertainment, if you will, at the museum and the exhibits. And no tin hats. And, there were several scientists there, and interesting talks. And it was a good opportunity. And the interesting thing, too, is that the people come from all over the world. There's over 100 countries people have come from to go to the Roswell UFO Museum, International UFO Museum and Research Center. And they got one heck of a library. If anybody wants to do a thesis project, boy, a lot of source material down there. People have donated their own collections, and so it's educational in the formal sense as well as the informal museum, walk by the exhibits and all that sort of stuff. Great place to visit. But remember, and this happened several times, some people think that Area 51 is right next door to Roswell. Yeah, it's about 600 miles away. And I don't recommend trying to see them both on the same day, No. Not that you can see much at Area 51.
Exactly. I don't even know if you can get out to the mailbox anymore. I guess you can. I haven't been out there in years and years, but there's certainly not much to see. Was there anything that surprised you that came out at the conference, or any big revelations or anything, or was there anything new that you had not heard before?
Not a lot that was new to me anyway. I've been at this a long time. Read my first book in 1958, gave my first lecture in 1967. Been doing a monthly column for the MUFON Journal for, 10 years maybe, something like that. So I get a lot of feedback. No, I wouldn't say that there was anything tremendously new, newsworthy, breakthrough or anything like that. On the other hand, there was serious discussion at the panels about Roswell and stuff, and Frank Kembler, a research scientist, has been examining small pieces of stuff that has been found out at the crash site, and we're waiting for more detailed results on the isotope ratios in the pieces to see whether, maybe we can prove that they're extraterrestrial, which would be neat. It takes a while and a lot of money to do some of these tests, but that was exciting in that sense, that he does have some pieces that look promising. Let's put it that way.
Back in the day when you were researching the Roswell story, were you ever able to see or touch any of the materials, the eye bar? No.
I've talked to people who handled the material.
Who, maybe Jesse Marcel Jr.?
Well, Jesse Marcel Sr. first. I was the first one to talk to him.
Sure.
And his son, Jesse Marcel Jr., whom we lost last year. And one of the things that's important about Roswell, and that the debunkers try to avoid talking about is that we're dealing with the most elite military group in the world. And I don't say that casually. The 509th Bomb Wing, which was the group based at Roswell in 1947, they're the ones who dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They dropped 2 more the next year at Operation Crossroads. They were the only group in the world at that time that had any nuclear weapons, either for explosion or storage or waiting, whatever. And people want to forget that. There were hand-picked officers, hand-picked men, all with high-level security clearances, and the best of the best. I mean, for example, the base commander was a West Point graduate. He was a colonel. Blanchard was his name. He went on after Roswell to get 4 more promotions to be a 4-star general and was vice chief of staff of the Air Force when he died of a massive heart attack at the Pentagon. Now, I've had people call him a loose cannon. How can you call a guy a loose cannon who got that far? Every promotion after colonel has to be approved by Congress. And all those guys had nuclear weapons under their control. Blanchard, when he was on his way up, was in Strategic Air Command and had thousands of nuclear weapons under his control. Now, you got to be careful about who you put in those positions. It's like the people who work at the missile launch sites. You don't just go around the street and say, hey, anybody want to work at the missile site? You got to stay down underground for a while. That's not how it happens. They all get tested and looked after, and we should be glad about that. You know, you don't want somebody with an itchy finger, finger on the button, so to speak. So the people at the base. Now, Jesse Marcel Jr., for example, he was only 11 when he handled pieces of the wreckage, but he went on to be a medical doctor, a flight surgeon. He was called back into the military. He had been in the reserve for a long time, served in Cambodia, you know, the place that we were never at, in the Vietnam War. Well, he was shot down there. He was called back in at 68 to serve in Iraq, and he flew 225 combat hours in helicopters, temperature up to 130. At age 68, he was called back in. And so I respect him so greatly. I've been in his home. I was in his father's home. His father was the intelligence officer at Roswell, which is how he happened to handle material. It wasn't that it was declassified. At the time, his dad came back from out on the ranch where the pieces were found. The stuff wasn't classified yet until the next day, you know, official ruling and all that stuff. So you get people like that. You get impressed. And I've had people attack the public information officer, a guy named Walter Haut. And they said, one guy, a debunker, said, an unnamed PIO, public information officer, released an unauthorized press story. Total baloney. He didn't even know the name of Walter, and it's in all the serious books about the place. And it was authorized by Colonel Blanchard, and he was more than a PIO. 20 bombing missions as a bombardier in World War II, and chosen to drop the instrument package during one of the atom bomb tests in 1946. And you choose your best guys to do that, because without the instrument package, the test is worthless, you know. So you got to be careful about listening to the debunkers. I want to debunk the debunkers. And they don't do their homework, because they know there's no evidence, you see, and they make proclamations. Research by proclamation is not scientific or rational or journalistically okay. It's investigation that we need. That's why I've been to 20 archives. Big arguments going on about Operation Majestic 12, named after your guy there.
MJ, our producer, who's secretly an MJ-12 spy.
And the people who are, they keep saying, well, this document can't be real because, and I've done an article where I listed 12 becauses, all of which I could demonstrate were totally false. by going to archives and getting factual information. And yeah, it's painstaking, but it's exciting. Every once in a while, you make a discovery that makes it all worthwhile. A typical one is that one of the listed members of this MJ12 group, which I think was real, and I think still exists, but with a new name, because whenever a code name gets publicized, you change the name. That's the rule. I worked under security for 14 years. One of the most interesting people was Dr. Donald Menzel, a Harvard University astronomer. And at first blush, you say, how could that be? He was a total debunker. He wrote 3 anti-UFO books. You don't need a high-level security clearance to teach astronomy at Harvard, obviously. And so everybody else we could tell just by their jobs, directors of CIA and chief of staff of the Air Force and people like that, they all had high-level security clearances. So how does Menzel fit in there? Obviously the documents are fraud. Well, I found one little mention of him in another file, contacted Harvard, had to get permission from 3 different people to see his papers. And I didn't like him while he was alive. I had one run-in with him, invited him to a lecture I was giving at Harvard, and he said, I know all about you, and I gave him my name. We'd never met. I said, you saw my congressional testimony next to yours? I've seen letters and memos. I didn't find out what that meant until last year, as a matter of fact. But, and his next statement set me off. He said, you can't be a scientist and believe in flying saucers. At which I laughed. Surely you're not serious, And he got angry. And he started a rant and rave. And I said, look, I just called out of courtesy to invite you to my lecture tonight. I didn't know whether they'd done it was to an engineering alumni group. I didn't know whether they'd done any advanced publicity, on campus as opposed to for their group. Oh, well, of course I won't go. So I told the story at the lecture. So I was not inclined to believe that he could have anything genuine to do with flying saucers until I got to Harvard, and to my total shock, I had seen his UFO correspondence at the American Philosophical Society library, nothing exciting there except debunkery kind of thing. But I go to his papers, there's a file labeled JFK, and holy cow, the Holy Grail. He and Kennedy was on the Board of Overseers at Harvard, and his area of interest was astronomy, so that's how he got to know Donald Menzel. And they got to know each other pretty well, even had breakfast together from looking at the files and stuff. Anyway, there's a letter from Menzel to Kennedy saying that there's one area in which I may be able to be of assistance. That is with regard to the National Security Agency. The big spy agency. Never says anything. No such agency. Mr. Snowden's outfit, if you will. And Menzel says, I had a longer continuous association with this organization than anybody in the country, 30 years, and its Navy predecessor. When we are properly cleared to each other, I can tell you more. Well, this was a total shock. And people say, well, you could have found it on your computer at home. No, I couldn't. Those files haven't been scanned at that time. Certainly they weren't. And so I went on to find out a lot more about Menzel. There was an unpublished autobiography and stuff. It turns out he was a world-class cryptographer, code breaker. He taught cryptography. He did classified work for a whole bunch of agencies. Nobody knew that. 2 special issues of Sky and Telescope, which are basically published by Harvard, Smithsonian Institution and Harvard. And neither one of them mentions any of the classified work he did after World War II. He served in the Navy, intelligence work. But who knew about all this other stuff? Nobody. And there were people in ufology telling me, Stan, you got to be kidding. He couldn't lead a double life. Well, none of them went to Harvard to look. And we all know people who led double lives. Think of all the spies. The 3 names that come to mind, Burgess, Philby, and McLean. These were 3 Englishmen who were spies for the Soviet Union who served in British intelligence. Now, boy, that's leading a double life, isn't it? It
wow.
seems to me it is, So anyway, I get upset at people who raise objections based on proclamation rather than investigations. It's tedious, but, well, I go into some of this. I've got one of my other books is Top Secret Magic, MAJIC, which is the story of MJ-12. And I raise the objections and demolish them. You can't ignore them.
Stanton, for people who might not be as familiar with the UFO field, could you just give a brief description of what MJ-12 was?
Well, it basically, Majestic 12 was a group established by President Truman in September 1947 in response to the recovery of the Roswell wreckage and bodies. And there had to be consideration about where do we go from here. And obviously they didn't know what were the intentions of the aliens. Where'd they come from? What do they want? And especially what can we learn from the wreckage we have that we don't want anybody else to learn, because these guys could fly circles around us. You know, Roswell, the big newspaper headline was July 8th, 1947. Kenneth Arnold's sighting of the Pacific Northwest, where he saw 9 objects moving as a saucer would if he skipped it across the water. That was June 24th, 2 weeks earlier. So there were about 1,000 sightings in between there when we've gone back and checked.
But was the Kenneth Arnold sighting, it was made public at that time, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah, it was made public.
And so I guess they probably thought, oh, gosh, this is getting out of hand. We've got to start squelching this stuth.
Well, when you find bodies in wreckage, suddenly you're not confronted with a high-performance aircraft. You're confronted with a civilization. Well, the key thing that I was getting at was that Arnold timed the flight of these objects from in front of Mountain A to in front of Mountain B. He was flying.
Yeah.
You know, a good, clear day, looking around. He was looking for a downed aircraft. There was a reward if you found the aircraft. And he timed these objects' flight. He was very curious. What's going on here? Because the speed record at that time was under 700 miles an hour. We hadn't gone supersonic yet, even. And yet, when he timed them, there was a clock on the dashboard, so to speak, and they were going about 1,500 miles an hour. So suddenly, hey, what the heck is going on here? And his thought was that they were secret American government vehicles. Sure. But 9 of them. You don't usually, if you're developing a new aircraft, you test 1 or 2. You don't test 9. You know?
Yeah.
And so that was only 2 weeks earlier than Roswell. And there were airline pilot sightings and other stuff, all in that intermediate 2 weeks. So when you get a rancher coming in with crazy wreckage to the sheriff's office in Roswell, you want to know, they call the base, and Major Jesse Marcel checks out the sheriff's office and looks at this crazy wreckage. And Commander Blanchard, base commander, sends Jesse out with, interestingly enough, he was an intelligence officer, but he was sent out with a counterintelligence corps guy, Sherd Cabot, because Colonel Blanchard was concerned about maybe there's some spies involved here. After all, this was the only base in the world that had nuclear weapons on it. You want to be careful, you know, and we knew, it turns out that the Russians had spies at Los Alamos on the nuclear weapons program. Some people forget that 2 people were given the death penalty, the Rosenbergs, for being spies for the Soviet Union at Los Alamos.
Right.
Ethel Rosenberg, many people aren't aware. You mean we executed a woman? You darn right we did.
Yep.
You know, so there was great concern, and you certainly couldn't go public with, when you don't have answers to the key questions. What do they want? Where are they from? Are they working with anybody here? You know, those are rather important questions 2 years after Pearl Harbor, when half the world was starving. The Marshall Plan, hoping to feed Europe, was just beginning at the same time that this happened. So, you know, it wasn't a world in which everybody was happy. Well, the war is over, now we can live happily ever after. Most people were starving. Because, you know, people forget how terrible, well, they probably weren't alive, but they forget how terrible World War II was. And look at it from an alien viewpoint. We Earthlings killed 50 million of our own kind. We destroyed 1,700 cities. And people may not be aware, but after the war and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 2 atomic bombs, we Earthlings exploded 2,000 nuclear weapons. Fortunately, no more on people. But from an outsider's viewpoint, this is a primitive society whose major activity is tribal warfare. Maybe they're coming down to punish us. Who knows what they want?
Oh boy. On that note, we need to go to take a break right now. You just ponder that, people, for a moment. And we'll be right back with Stanton Friedman. Hi there, welcome back. You're listening to Night Vision Radio. If you're just joining us, we're talking with nuclear physicist Stanton Friedman. We've been talking about one of his great areas of research, the Roswell event back in 1947. And he's sharing some stories with us and details about that event. And the last thing you said was, maybe someone was a little bit angry with us and maybe might want to attack us. So I'll let you carry on, and hopefully we aren't under attack.
Well, I hope not. They're kind of slow about it if they are. There are many indications that they are concerned about our activities, not only all the surveillance over military and nuclear installations, but things like turning off missiles in Malmstrom Air Force Base way back in the 60s. UFO shows up at the base, and the captain up there, who's in base security, radios down to or telephones down really to the bottom of the pit, where the missiles are ready to go, and tells them about the saucer. And the guy didn't take it too seriously down there. And then he calls back in 2 minutes, and now he's very upset. It's right over the front gate. And then suddenly 7 missiles, Minuteman missiles with nuclear warheads on them, poised to retaliate in the case of launch from the Soviet Union, go offline, one after the other. Now, theoretically, that cannot happen, but it did. And there was great consternation. And it's happened in several other places in the United States and also in the Soviet Union, except in the Soviet Union it went the other way. Suddenly a bunch of missiles were turned on, and the guy in charge had to think clearly enough to, I don't know what's going on here, but better shut these darn things off. So,
wow.
And there's the famous case on the West Coast where a missile launched down the coast from Vandenberg Air Force Base down, had a simulated warhead in it, of course. And along comes, there's a guy photographing this with new equipment. It's not so easy to catch a missile going down range at high speed. And the UFO flies around the thing and sends some beams of light at it and dislodges the simulated warhead. And the guy didn't know he was photographing this. He couldn't see it. And then the next day, when the film was being watched by his boss, he comes over to him and says, "What were you filming yesterday?" And shows it to him, and that's when he realizes that this thing had come along, going as fast as the missile, obviously, and was able to dislodge something that was on the missile nose cone. And that's kind of scary stuff if you're a military commander. And there are a number of cases where, orders were given back in 1952, which was the busiest year in the old Project Blue Book history, to shoot them down if they don't land when instructed to do so. Now, you can argue, how do you tell an alien to get his darn saucer down on the ground? But whatever it is, I have had 7 different instances in which people, after my lectures, have quietly come up to me and told me about being at a military base where airplanes were scrambled, a plane was scrambled, sent up to chase a UFO, and never came back. And if I've heard 7 cases, obviously there are a lot more than that out there. And
okay, you're saying that planes were scrambled to go and and find out what this was, or chase it away, or whatever. And
or shoot it down.
And the plane disappeared?
Yes, disintegrated and disappeared were the terms used in several articles. The New York Times, between 51 and 56, described how there were 200 fatal military plane crashes in the United States. And words like disintegrated and disappeared are kind of strong words. And 5 of the pilots had 100 missions or more in Korea, which meant they were good pilots because there were MiGs trying to shoot them down. And you don't survive 100 missions unless you know what you're doing. They come back to the United States, no MiGs. They have a fatal military crash. And so there was consternation. There was never any signs that these were intentionally offensive attacks, because I talked directly to some people. A fascinating story. One of the guys I talked to had been in a Navy base in South Carolina, scrambled. You know, you're sitting around waiting with nothing to do. The airplane's out on the runway, ready to go. And a radio call comes in, and there's an unknown, bogeys at 9 o'clock. You know, you've heard it on the air. And so they scramble this guy, and he goes up, and he's talking to the radio operator on the ground. And he gets up about 20,000 feet, and he says, okay, where is he? Well, he's coming up to you, buddy. And he looks up, and ahead of them, there's this bright light coming right at him. It's so bright that he puts his hand up, and he can see the bones in his hand, which is kind of a scary thought when you think about it. And so he figures, I'm being attacked here. What am I supposed to do? Well, you pull the trigger on the guns. That's what you do. Unfortunately, it turns out the guns hadn't been loaded, if you can believe that. And so he's talking on the radio to the ground, and describes this happened. It doesn't take very long. And then the UFO is gone. They're watching on radar down there. The UFO is gone, and he lands, and he gets interrogated by 2 guys in uniform and 2 guys in suits. And details. He didn't know who these suits were, where they were from, who they reported to. I believe MJ-12, of course. But when we talked about it, and this is umpteen years later, of course, we agreed that he probably wouldn't be alive if his guns had been loaded. He's a lawyer, incidentally. You know, to some people that means you can't believe anything he says. But you know what I'm saying. That this was a respectable individual.
Yeah, officer of the court. Absolutely.
Yeah, and he wasn't looking for attention or publicity. And I just got a report, 2 weeks ago, a Navy guy on a ship in the Pacific, where a bunch of guys on the deck of the ship, and the radar guy reports. I mean, they're out there, monitoring the skies. Is in the middle of the Pacific, and so they watch something coming in on the radar, and it goes, just past the ship, and the radar guy timed it, or checked its velocity as 3,500 miles an hour. It's back in the 60s, and they visually looked at it and timed it from that point to that point, and they come up with over 3,000 miles an hour, too. And a report was made, and they never heard anything more about it at all. One-way street. Information in, that's the end of that. Now, this makes sense out of something. There was an Air Force general named Bolander, Carol Bolander. He was an engineer, worked on the Lunar Excursion Module, and we landed on the moon in 1969, and July. And earlier that year, the Condon Report, the University of Colorado study, had recommended that Project Blue Book, ostensibly the only Air Force group concerned with UFOs for many years up to that time, be closed because it wasn't producing information worthwhile from an intelligence or technology viewpoint. And so the Air Force asked General Bolander, now that we landed on the moon, and he wasn't working 12-hour days anymore, when I talked to him, he mentioned that. Anyway, he was asked, with a totally clean slate, in other words, he had not worked with Project Blue Book at all. What should we do? Should we close it? What should we do about Blue Book? He wrote a memo, which we didn't see until 10 years later. It was released under Freedom of Information, I think by mistake, but anyway. And in the memo, he said, this resulted in the closure of Project Blue Book at the end of '69. In the memo, he says, moreover, reports of UFOs, which could affect national security, are made in accordance with JNAP, Joint Army, Navy, Air Force Publication 146, or Air Force Manual 55-11, and are not part of the Blue Book system. That's an astonishing statement. We've been told many years before that, all the years since. Blue Book was the Air Force group concerned with UFOs, the only group. 2 paragraphs later, he said, if we close Project Blue Book, the public won't have a place to report UFO sightings. However, as previously noted, reports which could affect national security will continue to be investigated using the procedures designed for that purpose. Now, the Air Force has said when Blue Book was closed, that's it. We haven't done anything more. Well, I was so curious when I saw this 10 years later, I decided I wanted to find General Bolander, and I did. I like looking for people with unusual names. Don't ask me to find John Smith. I'm not going to manage it. And I talked to him by phone. He's dead now, so you can't interview him for the program. Well, at least I can't, and maybe there are people who can reach out that way. Anyway, I gave him a little background. I was a scientist. I'd worked under security for 14 years, been strong interest in UFOs, was very intrigued with his memo. I said, it seems to me like you're saying that there were 2 separate channels for communications about UFOs. One were reports that could affect national security, and I just heard one, I told him, about a saucer going down the runway at a Strategic Air Command base where nuclear weapons are stored. By definition, that's a national security problem. Not supposed to be anybody there. And the other for if my wife and I go outside and standing at the end of the driveway and a UFO flies over, big deal. It happens all the time. He agreed with me. 2 separate channels of communication. Now, that's remarkable. Now, the question, of course, is, so where did those reports go? And this is where Majestic 12 fills the bill very neatly. Had to be a place with high-level security. And think of it as a Western wagon wheel without the rim. You got all these spokes going to the hub, And so the information goes to the hub, but it doesn't go around. In other words, everything is compartmentalized. And it's pretty obvious that you need certain kinds of follow-up on UFO sightings. For example, if you got wreckage, it's got to be analyzed in a classified lab by people with high-level clearances and great competence. We have a number of those, nuclear weapons labs, national labs, etc. Secondly, you have to have people who analyze instrumentation data. Now, the public doesn't own any. I don't own a radar. I don't think either of you do. We don't have our own radars. Those are government-owned facilities. There is instrumentation on board aircraft, which chases Russian aircraft. We want to not only take pictures, but electronic signatures, electromagnetic signatures. You make measurements. Somebody's got to handle that data. And so there's a need for an MJ-12, and if there wasn't one, we'd have to invent one. But I think it fits right in with General Bolander. And, it's kind of amazing that the press still hasn't picked up on the Bolander memo. I've talked about it in a lot of places. The New York Times and the Washington Post, neither one carried that story in 1952 about shoot them down if they don't land when instructed to do so. It's in a number of papers, but not those 2, the big guys.
Yeah.
And you wonder why. Now, President Kennedy wished that the New York Times, which had the story that we were going to, the Bay of Pigs thing, he wished they had run it so they wouldn't have done it, but save them some embarrassment. But so you wonder, is somebody controlling the press? A lot of people don't realize, that there was an office of censorship set up within 2 weeks of Pearl Harbor. The press couldn't cover certain subjects, couldn't use the word uranium, for example, was prohibited. You couldn't use it in a story. You couldn't talk about the Japanese Fugo balloons, which were carrying bombs that landed in the United States. Didn't do much damage, but we didn't want them to know how much damage they did or didn't do. So one wonders how much censorship there has been since, and especially, I hope people remember the Church Committee, a congressional committee in the early 70s, which was investigating reports that maybe there were some journalists that actually worked for the CIA. Can you imagine? Well, it turns out there were over 300 journalists, especially those working overseas, who were actually reporting to the CIA. And some of them were on the payroll. And that's with full cooperation from Life magazine, and other publications. So if the government had spies working for them, if you will, it wouldn't be surprising if information about UFOs was being channeled outside normal channels, if you will. So, I'm not talking conspiracy theory here. I'm talking about the real world in which we live. And for people who wonder about such things, the NSA, Snowden's outfit, we went after them in part of law under Freedom of Information, and eventually they agreed they had 156 UFO documents, but they were classified and could not be released. So a follow-up legal action was taken, and they finally released the text of these 156 top-secret Umbra UFO documents. Wow! There was a little problem. You could read one sentence per page. Everything else was whited out, believe it or not. And the CIA took us years to get their top-secret material, and it was all blacked out except a few words per page. And people say, oh, there's no cover-up, Stan. Well, tell me what's under the whiteout. Tell me what's under the black ink. And as a matter of fact, you can't, because the ink they used to black out the documents eventually dissolved what was underneath. And I'm sorry, we don't have any originals, they say.
Mm.
Pretty damn stupid if you want an honest opinion. But anybody who says there's no cover-up has to say, well, except for all that data that they're not releasing. There is a cover-up, minor detail. And I just got something 2 weeks ago. I had received a very interesting report from a Navy guy, and I decided, I had talked to a naval historian back at least 10 years ago and wanted their UFO information, and he says, we don't have any. Well, I sent him a report that had been prepared by Air Force Intelligence and Office of Naval Intelligence. Thank you for the interesting report, he said. But as I told you, we don't have any information about UFOs. Well, okay. After getting this good Navy report, I filed a Freedom of Information Act request for information, I'm quoting now, concerning unidentified flying objects, unidentified aerial phenomena, flying saucers, unidentified submerged objects, just for the period 2005 to the present. Okay, I get a response back. The Office of Naval Intelligence, ONI, is the oldest of the intelligence agencies, 1882, mind you.
Wow.
And the ocean is pretty large. They got a lot of ground to cover, a lot of water to cover.
Yeah.
They confirmed that ONI has, the Office of Naval Intelligence coordinated your request with the Nimitz Operational Intelligence Center, OIC, Operational Intelligence Center. They confirmed ONI has no records related to unidentified flying objects. They don't say anything about flying saucers, unidentified aerial phenomena, unidentified submerged objects. So I'm going to file an appeal. But you can appeal, it says. No, now, think about it for a minute. If you look up the Navy and on Wikipedia or wherever you want to look it up, it's a huge organization with, loads of ships, loads of planes, bases all over the place, monitoring 3/4 of the planet, that is the part that's covered with oceans. And they're trying to say that we don't have any records related to unidentified flying objects. They don't talk about those other things. But, that's absurd on its face. I have talked to dozens of former naval people. And ships, it's a closed system. So it can be a dozen guys on the deck of the ship when something goes over. So they're lying flat out, or the records go someplace else, like Operation Majestic 12. Because of the original 12, there were a bunch of Navy guys, Air Force guys, Army guys, and scientists. But there were Navy admirals on that committee. So I'm suggesting that we need a Woodward and Bernstein. I don't know where to find them, but,
wouldn't that be great? Yeah.
Well, I think it wouldn't take more than 6 months to establish that there was a massive cover-up. And obviously, the press coverage has been lousy, uninformed. One of the dozen or so PhD theses, and people look at me, what do you mean PhD theses? Well, there's more than a dozen about UFOs. One of them was about press coverage of the subject by Dr. Herbert Strentz, who went on to be a dean of the School of Journalism out at Drake University. Got his degree, his thesis was done at Northwestern University when Alan Hynek was there. And would you believe he read 10,000 clippings about UFOs? That would drive me up the wall.
Wow.
And he had some very strong comments to make about the inadequacy, the failure to deal with the proper sources, to take action, and so forth. So we're stuck at a crazy situation. There's ample data, but for some reason, they've created a laughter curtain which keeps people from reporting their sightings and keeps journalists from digging into them.
Yeah.
If you wanted to get reports, I tried this once on a radio station in Seattle by phone. The woman was saying, well, there aren't any sightings around. I said, look, if you ask for people to call into you with their sightings, I'll bet you'd get loads of them. Well, I don't think so. There aren't any sightings going on. MUFON had, over 1,000 reports last month, incidentally. And so she said, well, okay, I'll try. So we went to a commercial, and she asked anybody to call in, and the rest of the program was people calling in with great sightings. And she was astonished. And I get people saying, well, I haven't heard anything about saucers in months. And sometimes I've heard years. Mm-hmm. Well, if you get 700 to 1,000 reports a month, there's plenty going on, because most people don't report their sightings.
That's right.
And so, it's frustrating on the one hand. When I check my audiences, 10% have seen one. When I ask how many reported, 90% of the hands go down. Fear of ridicule is the problem. And I'm hoping we're heading in a new direction, but of course it isn't helped by the SETI people. Because, after all, they're out of a job. If aliens are visiting here, why are you going to listen for radio signals whose characteristics you don't know? Are they using AM or FM? What can I say? But if aliens are coming here, then maybe you need to learn sign language, instead of listening with a radio telescope. And if you look at their books, it's amazing. You just don't see any references to serious scientific studies. Most of them are astronomers. They don't talk about Alan Hynek's book. He was only the Air Force scientific consultant to Project Blue Book for 20 years and the head of the astronomy department at Northwestern University. Yeah. You'd think they'd read his book. Peter Sturrock, astrophysicist at Stanford University. He's got a book out, a good one, which he surveyed astronomers and got sightings by astronomers, besides lots of other cases. And so it's aggravating that people who claim to be scientists behave so unscientifically about UFOs. They want a body. Give them a body. Why would anybody give them a body if they had one? Who are they? We're talking national security here. Why? Certainly because of the technology. Wouldn't every country on the planet love to build his own flying saucer? They make wonderful weapons delivery and defense systems. We spent $10 billion on developing the stealth aircraft, and we used it. It's not a trivial matter. And many people have no understanding that there's one heck of a lot of research that goes on outside academia. They think, I had two guys tell me separately that if Roswell really happened, Stan, there'd have been an article in the Physical Review within 3 months. What utter nonsense.
No. I agree
Uh,
with you. There's a heck of a lot of research going on by individuals out there who are interested in just digging away and plugging away. It doesn't mean because they don't have a lot of letters after their names that their evidence should be ignored. I think there's a...
Well, it's not only those guys. Those are the independent guys. But I'm talking about major organizations. Look, when I was working on nuclear airplanes way back in the 50s, 1958, at General Electric Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Department, we spent $100 million that year. That was a lot of money then. We employed 3,500 people. 1,100 of them were engineers and scientists. It wasn't 6 professors and 12 grad students, for goodness sakes. The NRO, National Reconnaissance Office, which builds satellites that can, spy satellites that can cost $500 million each. They had a contract with Boeing to improve the architecture of the satellites, more bang for the pound, if you will, and less energy and all that sort of thing. After they spent $13 billion, they decided they weren't getting what they wanted, so they canceled the program. $13 billion.
Oh, gosh. Can you hang up? Can you hold it right there, Stanton,
yes,
and continue with this right after this next break? And then also, if you're game, I'm going to give you some questions from the chat room. I know I've missed a lot of them. So people in the chat room, if you hear me asking questions and I don't get to yours, please repost it because you guys have a lot of questions tonight. We're going to be right back with Stanton Friedman, so hang in there. You're listening to Night Vision Radio. I'm your host, René Barnett. My guest tonight is physicist Stanton Friedman. We're talking about all things UFO. And now, Stanton, if it's okay, I'm going to start posing some questions to you from our listeners in the chat room. Regarding what you were saying earlier about those U.S. and Russian nuclear armaments being affected on bases, were you able to get any FOIA documentation on that, or what were your sources on that? That's from Analog in the chat room.
Well, there's a book by Robert Hastings about nukes and UFOs who goes into a lot of that. But I also met with Robert Salas, S-A-L-A-S, who was the commander at that Malmstrom base where the missiles went down one after the other. And he's written a book. I wrote the foreword for the book. He did a splendid job. And, we pick good people to head missile facilities. You can't have any idiot sitting there with his finger on the button kind of thing. I was very favorably impressed with Bob, and he had an outstanding career in the Air Force. And there are other witnesses, and it happened more than once. So we're not talking about an isolated event with one observer. There were other people there at that place. There was an investigation. Boeing was involved. And somehow Bob was allowed to talk many years later. This has happened back in the 60s, you understand. And he's not a young man anymore. But then I'm not either, So we've got good sources on that. Now, it's hard, as soon as you start talking about nuclear weapons and missiles, you're in very touchy territory when it comes to security. And I don't blame them for being careful about that, because you don't want to give out anything that would give somebody else an idea, hey, maybe I could do that, War is on all the time.
Isn't that what happened, or was alleged to have happened in the Rendlesham Forest incident?
We don't know that they stopped the missiles from operating, but there were certainly nuclear weapons at the base, although that had not been publicly acknowledged prior.
That's right.
Keep a little secret here or there. And I've talked to Colonel Holt, who was the assistant base commander, and there's no question that there was a major event there. Not only people seeing things, but the darn thing landed and then took off, and there was increased radioactivity where it had landed. And we were lucky that came out because it was a joint American-British thing, and somebody got a document on our side of the pond and followed up on it, and now other guys have talked. And that's probably the best case in England. Nick Pope has written about it. Larry Warren, who was there, has written about it. Rendlesham Forest, yes. It's the English Roswell, but of course there were no bodies. Sorry, guys.
Right.
No
right.
wreckage.
Right. And let's see. I forgot to write down the name of who asked this question, so I do apologize to whichever of my chat roommates I've left out here. But the question is in regards to Linda Moulton Howe's interview with an ex-Air Force pilot about an alleged alien base in Antarctica. Are you familiar with that? And
no, I haven't, but there have been rumors about alien bases, Nazi bases, all kinds of bases at the center of the Earth, going in at the poles, Antarctica. And to put it simply, they're in my gray basket. Maybe. Not enough data.
Right.
Those are pretty serious things, and I don't have my own plane to go down and check out Antarctica. Sorry.
Okay, yeah. No, it's funny. It keeps coming up lately, Antarctica, and then it did remind me of that I had heard what you just said, that I've heard stories about both poles, things going in and coming out the other end and so forth. But also, I know you've opined on the Bob Lazar story. And,
it's still a hot issue.
And, I guess recently there's been someone that's come forward that claimed to have worked with Bob Lazar.
I talked to him. Yes, okay. Yesterday I talked with Dr. Krenkel, who has a PhD from MIT and is a consultant, has his own business in New Mexico, and he was mentioned by George, the fine journalist, George Knapp from KLAS-TV. And I talked to Dr. Krenkel, and the impression had been given by some things that had been written that he verified Bob Lazar. Well, what that really meant when I talked to him was that he was a consultant at Los Alamos from time to time. And while he was there, on occasion, he had noted Bob Lazar, and he had met him, and didn't have any close interaction or anything, but, and he had a pocket protector, and he looked like a scientist, and sounded like one, and he obviously had a clearance, or he wouldn't have been there. But I checked with him on this, because people were saying that, well, he verified that Bob was telling the truth. No. He verified that he saw Bob there, and probably in a scientific capacity. And Bob's name was in the Los Alamos phone book.
Sure.
But that he worked at the Maison facility. He's a sharp guy, bright guy, and a good technician. He built a jet-powered car and runs a scientific company, United Nuclear by name, as a matter of fact. But when I talked to Dr. Krenkel, he knew that Bob had worked there and so forth, but he never verified that Bob had any of the credentials. And that has been my problem from the start. I was asked about Bob 25 years ago. People were claiming, he was claiming, that he was a nuclear physicist with a master's degree in physics from MIT and another one in electronics from Caltech. Wow, those are impressive credentials. So people knowing that I'm a nuclear physicist and a lot older than Bob were asking me about him. So I figured I'd better check. So I did several things, and nobody else seems to have repeated them for some crazy reason, but I checked with MIT. I talked to 5 different people there. They never heard of him. The physics department, the registrar's office, I talked to the legal counsel. No, there was no way for the government to wipe out records. I talked to the guy who kept the theses, because for a master's in physics at MIT, you need a thesis. And I couldn't find any sign of him. And I also checked with, he wasn't a member of the American Physical Society or the American Nuclear Society. I checked with Caltech, two different people there, and they never heard of him. But I went further. George Knapp gave me the name of his high school, Bob's High School in New York State. And I called them and talked to a woman there, dug out his files, and, well, what she told me was that, A, he didn't graduate with his class. He graduated in August. That raises some questions. More importantly, he only had one science course, chemistry. Even more importantly, he wasn't in the top 10. I asked her, was he in the top 10 of his class? No. Top 20? No. She's beginning to laugh a bit. Top 50? No. Top 100? No. And she told me. He was like 266 out of 360 in his high school. That's the bottom third. You cannot get into MIT if you're in the bottom third of your high school class. I don't care how smart you are, and especially with just chemistry. I know I was accepted to MIT out of high school. I was valedictorian in my class. I couldn't afford to go. It was $950 a year. Now it's $35,000. But I also checked. He was at Rachel, Nevada, the little alien, a hotbed of UFO activity and good coffee. And he was there answering questions, and somebody asked him to name any of his professors. That's a legitimate question. MIT, Caltech, hey, we're talking top drawer here. And he said, well, let me see, William Duxler, he'll remember me from Caltech. Well, I went, I heard a tape of this, I didn't hear the program. I went to my director of the American Physical Society. There was only one William Duxler. I called him, and he never taught at Caltech. He only taught at Pierce Junior College. And he was angry that somebody was using his name, so he checked, and it turns out, when I called him back, he had checked, and he had Bob in a night school course at Pierce Junior College at the very same time when he was supposedly at MIT 2,500 miles away. So that claim was nonsense. Furthermore, he claimed that Los Alamos had 500 pounds plus of element 115, the mysterious element 115. Now, Bob didn't invent it, discover it, establish its reality. There was physicists at an accelerator, ran the accelerator for a couple of weeks, and made 4 atoms of the stuff. And that's good for physics. You can't do anything with it. And it has a very short half-life. All the trans-uranium, that is, elements with atomic numbers higher than that of uranium, 92, are radioactive. The half-lives vary, but 115 has a half-life under 2 minutes. That means there is no possible way you could collect 500 pounds of the stuff. It's gone, you know. So
I guess the big deal at the time, the big deal at the time, I guess, was that element 115 was not yet on the charts. I think it was up to about element 111 or something at that time.
Well, it was expected to be found, but you needed a big accelerator run at high power for a long period of time. That's not easy. It's not cheap. And so Bob didn't invent it, discover it, and it had been written about in an article in Scientific American years before Bob said anything about 115. You know, it's a science fiction approach to the problem. Hey, maybe we got a mysterious element here, and stuff like that. But now Bob is a bright guy, and he did work at Los Alamos for a short period of time. And
yes, he did.
He was out at Area 51,
yep.
And we have to give him credit for making Area 51 a household word. Remember, it was established for the development of the U-2 aircraft. They needed a place away from people where they could test a new airplane, a spy plane, and for a whole bunch of other spy planes. Now, the most outstanding thing about his claims was that he told people on 3 successive Wednesday nights that there'd be something flying at a certain time, let's say 8:30. And they went out and they saw it.
Yep.
But who knows what it was? So
that's true.
The notion that he was back engineering flying saucers, a scout ship or so forth, has no substantiation behind it, and I have trouble believing anything said by a guy who will lie about his background. His friend Gene Huff asked me, well, what would it take to convince you Bob was legit? I said, well, this is a friendly conversation. I said, well, copies of his diplomas, the title of his thesis, the name of his thesis advisor, maybe listings in directories of professional organizations or a resume, stuff like that. And I sent him a whole bunch of stuff. You're going to tell me that somebody has master's degrees from Caltech and MIT and doesn't have them? You put it up on a wall. Maybe
sure.
It gathers dust, but a lot of effort goes into those. And also, incidentally, Bob has never said anything about having a bachelor's degree. How do you get a master's without a bachelor's?
That's kind of difficult. But you know what is interesting to me, just as a side, he came out basically in 1989 to George Knapp.
Yes.
At KLAS television station, and
a darn good reporter
blurted out this story. Exactly. That's my point. Okay. George Knapp is a newsman. He's a news reporter. He's a journalist.
A darn good one. Yes.
Yep. So I'm sure he must have also looked into this credential question.
Well, I talked to him 2 weeks ago. He says, I have no faith that Bob had any of those degrees. He's not claiming that he did.
No, but does he believe Bob's story? I thought he did.
Well, he believes that Bob was out there and that he had something to do with Area 51. That doesn't mean we have any basis for assuming he worked on back engineering flying saucers. There's no evidence of that. There's no piece of paper that even has a title for him of scientist, physicist, those fancy titles you get.
Right.
I had titles every place I worked. It's a work classification, and you're just certain status and whatever it is. So George, now remember, I worked under security for 14 years. And George was not familiar with some of the basics. Like, at one time he thought if you worked at Los Alamos, you had to be a scientist. I'm sorry. As I mentioned on the aircraft nuclear propulsion program, only 1,100 out of 3,500 employees were engineers or scientists. You got all kinds of people. And certainly he had a security clearance, and I'll let you in the door. I've been to Los Alamos when I was working on nuclear rocket engines, which they were working on at the same time. But your clearance gets transferred, and you have to have a clearance. So I've never said that Bob didn't work at Los Alamos. The phone book proves that he did. But it certainly doesn't say he did anything that relates to back engineering a flying saucer. They worked out at the Maison facility. They needed people because the professors come there without their grad students. It's a unique facility. It's the only one in the world that has the characteristic beam. And he's a bright guy. But none of that means he was back engineering flying saucers.
I agree with you. I mean, I knew Bob Lazar. Actually, I had a production company several years ago by the name of Blue Book Films, by the way, and we owned the life rights of Bob Lazar for a couple of years.
You were going to make a movie, weren't you?
Gonna make a movie, and didn't get it done. We did get an offer for a television movie, but the terms weren't that great, so we didn't do it. But we always intended to do that film, and I was always hoping that there would be more evidence emerging, but so far it really hasn't, has it?
No, it has. Look, I'm as disappointed as anybody else, and I'm impressed with the guy. And I talked to Dr. Krankel today and yesterday, and was very impressed. He's a straightforward scientist, and we talked scientific stuff and agreed about a lot of things. And there's no question Bob was there, but being there doesn't mean at Los Alamos that he was working on back engineering flying saucers, and he used terms like gravity wave amplification. I don't know what the heck that means. It's a science fiction term. I talked to a radio man from Berkeley who interviewed Bob with a physicist in disguise along with him, and every once in a while the physicist would ask a question that Bob couldn't answer. And he told the interviewer that, how much you want to bet he doesn't show up tomorrow? They're supposed to do a second session. And he didn't. So, don't ask me the psychology of Bob Lazar. I won't claim to know anything about it. He's a wannabe, I guess, and he certainly was as bright as most of the people around. That isn't the question. But is his story true?
We just don't know. We just don't know. Now, let me, if you don't mind, we've only got about 5.5 more minutes left in the show, and I got a couple of quick questions for you. One is about the changing shapes of flying saucers, of UFOs rather. Derhuff says that in the 50s, of course, we saw the saucers and all that, and then later the triangular shapes, and now, we see triangles and orbs. So what do you, are they advancing their technology, or are we seeing different things?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think we've been under surveillance for thousands of years. I think every planet that has finally gotten its act together and can act as a planet, which we certainly haven't done yet, is concerned about surprise attacks. They don't want a Pearl Harbor any more than we would like another one. So the word may go out. I mean, in modern era is many years long, and, guys checking by, maybe it's a different race of people. Maybe it's somebody else's turn to monitor the idiots, us. Who knows? I don't know what's going on, and maybe we're getting better at duplicating their technology. The triangles may be ours, for all I know. The inventor of the flying wing, and I suddenly dropped his name out of my mind entirely. It's late. One of his pilots saw a flying saucer, and it definitely wasn't one of our flying wings, but it may be that we have copied successfully or gotten better. The B-2 is kind of triangular shaped. So I don't know whether some of these are ours and some of these might be theirs. And the old motherships tended to be cylindrical, not big triangles. On the other hand...
that's right, the big cigar-shaped ships.
Yeah, and, we've had... Look, if you go to O'Hare Airport, don't get caught in the traffic, it's a busy place, you'll see many different airplanes. And different numbers of different airplanes. You don't have 10 of this, 10 of that, or 10 of something else. You might have 2 of this and 50 of that. 737s are very popular these days, for example. So I don't know what's going on. And, they relieved the crew. Maybe the guys who were coming here earlier were being punished. Spend 2 months near Earth, boy. That'll provide punishment for life, we don't. Also, there may be commercial involvement here. I hate to say this, but the Earth is the densest planet in the solar system. A cubic foot of Earth weighs more than a cubic foot of any of the other planets. And no, they are not all alike. There may be valuable minerals here. Being the densest planet means there's more heavy metals here. Iridium, osmium, things like that you've never heard of, but that have very special properties and are very rare in the universe because we measure the light from stars. And so maybe they've been mining stuff in their commercial operations, and we're getting in the way. There are loads of reports of objects coming in and out of the water. Are they mining something down there? There are diamonds near Africa. There are nodules of metals other places. Who knows what reasons they're here?
Absolutely.
So there are many answers that we don't have, that I don't have anyway.
Not yet, anyway.
Right.
Now, maybe time for one last question. I know that you did work on the Betty and Barney Hill case.
Yes,
done
the book is
research
captured.
in that area. Right.
Yeah.
And you wrote that with Betty's niece, right?
Kathleen Martin, she did 85% of the work. I only did 15, but I did write about the star map. And
Wonderful.
I had met Betty and Barney and so forth. So
Well, oh, that's wonderful. I got a chance to meet Betty and got a chance to have quite a few conversations with her over time. And I asked her what she thought about, this was during the 80s and 90s when there was a lot of the UFO abduction cases being brought forward. And I asked her what she thought about some of these cases. And she said to me that she really believed the Travis Walton event.
yes.
And so in the chat room, someone would like to know what you think about Travis Walton.
Well, I was part of a team that interviewed him in 1978 in Arizona. And he's in my movie UFOs Are Real. It's listed at my website, www.stantonfriedman.com.
Got about 10 seconds, Stan. I'm sorry.
Okay, I believe Travis entirely. He's
Wonderful.
number one.
That's great. Also, people are asking after you how you're doing. Hope you're doing well. And
I'm doing
got
very
some
well.
friends?
I had a heart attack a year ago, but it didn't knock me down for more than a week, and away we go.
good for you. That's wonderful. Thanks so much for joining us. And I hope everyone will join us next week for another edition of Night Vision Radio. Good night, everybody.